Good morning. This is Gaming Perspectives with
Saul
and Jolene. And today we're talking about space combat.
Space combat.
In role-playing.
Oh.
In role-playing games.
Oh, yeah. Role-playing games.
Tabletop role-playing.
Not in real life.
No.
I wonder if the space combat, there isn't any, huh? Not yet.
With the satellites and meteors, maybe?
No, don't we have the International Space Station and people go up there and do work and stuff?
Yeah, but International Space Station implies implicitly that they like each other.
Well, not anymore. Remember, Russia's pulling out of the International
They don't have guns
Station.
on there. All they have are rockets to take people up there, dude.
Okay. So space combat in RPGs.
Yes. I will tell you my first
there you go.
experience of space combat. And
First and only experience, I believe.
yes, because all the other space games we played, I don't think anyone shot at us when we played Traveler.
What about Star Trek? Didn't nobody shoot at your ship ever?
Maybe, but
It was inconsequential.
I think we avoided combat.
Well, it is Star Trek, so you're supposed to avoid combat. Unless it's hand-to-hand, then you're all out.
But I was very excited when Pathfinder's Starfinder came out because I
That's
thought
correct.
it was really cool. I made Saul buy the book.
I know, you made me buy the book right away. I was shocked.
And we went to, believe it was Kubla Khan one year.
Kubla Khan, right?
And they had a whole section of new section of Starfinder for the Pathfinder Society.
Right. They actually had Starfinder societies.
I don't know. Did they call it that? I thought it was still just called Pathfinder.
Yeah, maybe. I don't remember. It was early on. You're right.
And we got there.
It was a little later.
It was late at night.
Yeah.
Not real late. Maybe 9 o'clock.
Well, that's pretty late.
Maybe
I think
8
it was
o'clock.
8 o'clock.
It had been a pretty long day. And the game was going absolutely fine until they broke out the space combat, which I go, oh, this should be cool. And he brought out a grid map or
A large piece of graph paper.
a large piece of graph paper. And Jolene's eyes went ahead and glazed straight over as soon as they started talking about how many moves ahead you had to plan. And Felipe got all excited and started planning his moves out. Because you didn't know you planned 3 moves ahead and the other people planned 3 moves ahead. And then you said what you were going to do and they said that what they were going to do and there were no changes.
Well, you were writing it down, right?
Yeah.
You were writing down what you were going to do. And it was pretty funny because you're right. I could tell that Jolene was...
All the light went out of my eyes. And
she
I
was
went,
checking out.
okay, I'm done.
I think she was checking out during the explanation, which was pretty quick, right? And the guy who was running it had been running it for a long time. Well, he had been running Pathfinder a long time, and he was really quite a good GM.
Yes, he was very excited about the space combat. I was not so excited about the space combat.
And it was an introductory adventure, so like everything we did was like, this is how you do skill rolls. This is how you do combat. This is how you do certain types of situations, how you handle them. So it was a very learning type of adventure. And then we did get into the space combat part, and and then I didn't quite check out as much as Jolene, but I could tell, one, it was pretty late, so you were pretty tired, and 2, you were just like, wow, this is a lot of information.
When he says it was a quick explanation, it had to be about 5 or 6 minutes.
Well, probably a little bit longer than that.
May not sound like a long time, but when there's graph paper and hexagons involved and which way you can move your ship, and Felipe understands all this because he's obviously done space combat before, and he was the pilot, so he was the one who actually got to do most of the stuff, right?
Right.
He got to plan it, and then he got to execute it. And I think my job was something like, push this button if this happens, right?
Well, I don't think there was even that. I think there might have been a skill roll for firing your weapons, but I don't think so. I seriously should have looked at it right before this episode. But what I do remember, that the graph paper was pulled out, and it was obviously on a 2D level, right? It was on a flat plane. And the ships, you would have to give orders for 3 turns ahead of time. And like you said, you would write it down, and then the opposing person would write it down, which is the GM. And within those 3 turns, you would be able to fire or not fire, and hopefully the opposing ship would kind of like be in the way of the torpedoes that you're firing at, because you're talking about great distances, you're forecasting where you're going to shoot and all that, which I thought was interesting, which kind of reminded me, it kind of reminded me of diplomacy, right? Because you would write down your orders, you would write them down, and then it also reminded me, I don't know if it was, what game it was an old game called Wooden Ships and Iron Men, where you would write down where you're going, and then you would write down if you're firing and what side you're firing from, right? And
which makes perfect sense, because when I was reading about this topic, I guess that space combat is really based on like
naval combat,
yeah. But they just moved it up into space. So I thought it was interesting in one way. I was sitting there going, okay, this is very, what do you call it? Simulationist.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Where,
I guess you're going for that. I don't know how simulationist it
well,
is.
you it's like you got your little ships out, and I thought of them as ships because it seemed like not spaceships, but actual ships. It reminded me of Battleship the most, right?
Yeah. I gotcha.
Yeah. A5. Did I hit you? So.
Yeah, I guess a little bit of that. Yeah.
But it was interesting. It wasn't horribly boring, but it was quite boring. Felipe, I like, because he would do 3 turns, right? So the only excitement I had for that 30 minutes of combat in space, which was the end of Jolene playing that game after that, because I couldn't handle it, was trying to see if the guy was actually going to hit Felipe. So it was like
our ship.
Yeah. Well, it was Felipe doing all the stuff. So.
Right, the maneuvering. I think there's a couple things there. One, it was late. By the time we got to space combat, it must have been about 10 or 11 o'clock,
yeah.
Which was toward the end of the adventure anyway. And then you left, and then Jim goes, is she coming back? I go, nah, she's pretty tired. So, I mean, it's been a long day. And we're at a convention, so we start pretty early. Jolene gets me up at 8 o'clock no matter what time I go to bed. So we've been going at it, for 12 hours at that time, and it can be exhausting. This was before the pandemic, so we were going, and I don't even know where Augustine was.
He was with us.
Was he there?
Yeah.
Oh.
I think.
Was he playing with us?
I think so.
I don't remember that.
But he might have been with the other boys. I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, so it was. I thought it was an interesting aspect of not an aspect, but a way of mixing how to do space combat in an RPG. A lot of times, it's kind of just like looked over, right? In most RPGs, you space combat in different games isn't really, RPGs are not about space combat, because it becomes very difficult to simulate that, and in a meaningful way, or in a way that
engages the players. All the players.
Yes, all the players. It's a problem. I mean, I remember playing Traveler, and the only people that did anything was the pilot and the gunner.
Right.
And everybody else was like watching the show.
While I was doing the research for this one, that was the biggest complaint about space combat, was that if you take Star Trek for an example, everybody has different roles, right? You have the captain and the navigator, and the captain, the navigator, science officer,
even the engineer when you get hit,
the security officer who fires the torpedoes, the engineer, and basically you have roles that you play. But if you end up in combat, it's really kind of rote. You just do it by memory, or you have, if you get hit, then the engineer has to fix something. If you want to fire, the security officer fires. If you want to maneuver, the captain gives the orders of where to maneuver. But other than that, it's like there's no opportunity for actual role playing during that particular time.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of tough to role play during combat. You're right, no matter what game. And I think Star Trek Adventures does it pretty well, getting people involved in the game, because like before, in Traveler, if you were a science officer, if you were an engineer or anything like that, you really weren't involved in combat, unless the engineer, if your ship got damaged. But usually you didn't deal with it in real time. You would wait till the battle was over, and if you survived, you'd be fixing the ship. I think Star Trek Adventures does it pretty well because everybody's doing something, and they do have a little bit of leeway as to
what they can do,
what they're going to do first, right? For example, the science officer, what is he going to do? Because he does the scanning, right? He looks in that little thing that Spock
does he make that noise when he does it?
Yeah, usually it has to, unless it doesn't work. So when he looks into his scanner, he's looking for, the GM would ask him.
He's making an observation roll, right?
Right, observation roll. But what is he looking for? Is he looking for weaknesses in their ship design? Is he looking for...
Captain, I am looking to see if it's a Romulan ship. I can tell by the little poofs of stuff that come out when it's cloaked.
Oh, when it's cloaked.
Because there's always a degree of variance.
Okay, so yeah, you're probably not in space combat if it's cloaked, right? Because they can't fire while cloaked.
But what it does, because you know how Romulans are, Saul.
Yeah, they're tricky.
They get really close. The Klingons do the same thing. They get really close right up on you where they're going to fire and take out your weapons, and then they uncloak and do it. So that's why you always have to look for that variance so that you know where they are.
That's a lot of variance looking. Anyway, so you could look for like that if it's a cloaked ship, but then it's not really a combat. I guess it is pre-combat or whatever. But other times is once they're uncloaked, you can see if there are any weaknesses in their systems, in their ship.
Yeah.
Like they might be target. You might want to target their shields. You might want to target their engines.
Always target their weapons array.
Or the weapons array, or a multitude of things, right? And then as a science officer, you can ask specifically what you're looking for, and then you roll based on your whatever skill that is applied in that situation. The engineers, maybe you have to. It's been a long time since I played Star Trek Adventures in combat because I really do avoid it. It is the engineer can supply power to certain systems, right?
Well, and I think that's one of the things that I was reading about is that most people's general complaint is that everybody doesn't get to role play during combat. It's usually just the pilot and whoever is shooting guns, right? Or the captain or whatever.
Yes.
But they say to make it more exciting, combat, it should be as deadly as possible in space so that you avoid it.
Right.
One, you're in space. So for Star Trek, they say there should always be the hit should always breach the hull, right? So that everybody has to go and fix it, that you have to actually have role-playing opportunities.
Right.
Now, that wouldn't work like in Firefly or The Expanse. Well, no, in The Expanse, everybody's wearing their space suits.
They can be.
So, or usually when they're going to go into combat, just in case, because one, they're maneuvering fast, so they are going to...
Were they wearing their suit a lot? I don't remember.
Because if it gets breached, the air is going to start to go. And as you know, you're not going to die right away, but you probably want to have a spacesuit on so you can actually breathe good air and get to wherever the hole has been breached so you can fix it.
Maybe patch it.
Yes. That's one of the things to make it as deadly as possible so you avoid it. And in all of Saul's games, we avoid it. I think we might have got fired on once by Klingons, but I think we did a diplomatic solution to keep from doing that, right?
Yeah, I think you did. I think you figured out in that particular adventure something happened, so you guys were able to, even though you were shot at, you were able to avoid continuing the fight or actually get into combat.
In all the other space games I played in, space opera, I don't ever remember actually having any combat. And if there was combat, we were either on a planet or maybe on a ship, but inside the ship, it wasn't like whole ship-to-ship combat.
Right. You guys were having maybe gun battles on a space station is where I set adventures on.
Yeah.
It was a large one. So when I first wrote up what I was thinking about writing is space is... I was joking. I was going to space the fighter frontier and combat. And I said, that's a frontier that no RPG player wants to play in because space is deadly already, right? If you think about what is it? I forget what movie it was or what show or what a book I read. And basically you're in a tin can, maybe probably a little bit stronger than tin, but you're in a tin can and you got these basically rockets strapped to it and it's propelling you through space, right? And it's space is not nice to most organisms, and especially humans. You're talking about a small breach. Even on the space station now, they say that they have like these little micro meteors that will pierce the shell of this thing, and sometimes they gotta spend hours, supposedly, looking for where this leak is.
They have to find it, yeah.
Right, and then they patch it up right then and there, and so it was very interesting to see in The Expanse, which is Traveler like in the setting, maybe slightly a lower tech level than most Traveler games are set in, but because they can jump in space, and that's how they travel, by jumping, which you can travel so many light years in a single.
That's in Traveler, not in The Expanse. They don't do that.
No. This is Traveler. There's rumors that, I think that, not rumors, but the guy who wrote it, or wrote the game. I mean the game. Who wrote the movie and the books? He said it was a basis for a video game, and then he started running it as a role playing game. Now, he never said what system he used, because I guess he didn't want to, I don't know. But anyway, so he played with his group, and that's where he ironed out all these ideas.
So it probably had to be Traveler, because he wrote those books a while ago.
I have no idea. But what I like about it, the movie and the books,
show.
The show, is that how it shows combat being very deadly, and how you're not protected in any way by the ship's hull. The hull, the outer part of the ship.
HULL.
There's no, I think, do they even talk about armor plating? They don't even talk about that, right? Because the bullets or whatever, the munitions that they're using against each other are so strong, they penetrate anything that they can you could put on the outside of a ship.
Yeah, they try to avoid it, and most of the time they have missiles fired at them.
Oh, there's missiles too, yeah.
And not only that, they have to make sure they're strapped into their seats, because otherwise
they're moving around.
And other objects in the ship will move around too.
Right, because they talk about what is it? Not centrifugal force, but G's, and how you're talking about, if you accelerate, then everything inside the ship has to accelerate, and when it tries to slow down, those things are still accelerating. So.
And they do talk about how deadly it is, because if you are accelerating to get out of the way of a missile, you're going really fast, right? A couple of G's probably. And they pump that stuff into them to keep from having strokes. Yeah. Which I'm like going, which makes you go, okay, I don't want to be in space combat in real life or on paper.
Right. And then the big ships are basically like huge warships. You're right. It's like naval combat.
It is.
Yeah. Space Navy. What do we call it? Space Force. Yeah. When I was thinking about introducing this subject, I said space is very deadly, and it already is pretty deadly. All you gotta do is blast a sizable hole into the ship, and they start losing air. Now, of course, you can compartmentalize ships' interiors to make them like airlocks in different areas.
Right. Or if you're in Star Trek, there's always a force field that you can
Star
put
Trek
there.
is way beyond.
I'm just saying.
Way beyond what the level of
tech that we have,
or even close to what we have, right? And I think what happens in space combat, two factors: there's realism and suspension of disbelief, right? Because those two are the things that govern how you want to handle space combat. Because if you're looking at realism, if you're looking at like Traveler, if you're looking like The Expanse, lower tech level worlds or universes, then combat is going to be super deadly. Because there's no such thing as armor. There's no such thing as gravity plates. There's no such thing as shields. And all those things keep you alive, right? Because there's no, like when they travel in Star Trek, nobody's being squished into jelly because they're accelerating so fast inside the ship. There's some bubble or something that prevents them from experiencing G acceleration, no matter how fast or how slow or whatever.
Yeah.
Right?
Otherwise, they couldn't go warp speeds.
Well, you could go warp speed, but getting to warp speed is the problem, right? Like most games or most universes in RPGs, they do deal with G's forces, right? And they deal with approaching the speed of light. For example, I'm gonna go way back machine. Space opera, you go in they call it light seconds. How far light
travels
goes
in a second,
right? And until you reach 300 light seconds, you're basically traveling in the real world, in the real universe. And then once you hit 300, your FTL drives, your faster than light drives, kick in, and they send you into hyperspace. And that to me is more like, what is it? Star Wars, right? Hyperspace. Even that word was, when I first heard it, was in probably Star Wars. And in Star Wars, and therefore also space opera, which kind of mimic the ideas of Star Wars, basically you go into another universe for that short period of time that you're traveling, or that period that you're traveling in space. And in that space, in that universe, things travel at super high speeds, breaking the laws of physics, and you are traveling faster than light. So that's how space opera worked, and that's pretty advanced, right? Because this space opera is trying to mimic Star Wars in a sense. So Star Wars, just like
Star Trek
is a highly advanced civilization, and they have shields, and you get hit by depending on the size of the ship and how much armor your ship has, the blasters or whatever they call them, they damage your ship, they hit your ship, and their shields go down or lessen, or the armor plating gets messed up slowly but surely, and you're dealing with this idea of pummeling the ship until that system breaks down, and then you can actually damage the ship.
That's why in Star Trek and Star Wars, they say in space combat that the ships actually have like hit points, right?
Right.
And so that...
And almost any game.
And there... The people that I was reading, and was mostly on Reddit, these people talking about space combat.
Reddit.
This one guy didn't like the idea that ships had hit points, right? He goes, basically, you're just shooting at each other or shooting at the enemy until your hit points on your ship are so low that you need to get out of there, instead of actually going, okay, this is going to kill us because our ship is going to get destroyed and we're all going to blow up, and moving, right?
Well, you didn't even have to blow up, right? If you make a big enough hole and everybody gets sucked out of it,
then yeah.
But you're right. Unless you're strapped down into
unless you're in a seat
and you have your
spacesuit on,
you're gonna get sucked down into space, and bye. And
the other thing I was thinking about when we thought about this, talked about doing this subject, I was thinking about when we went to the Silicon and we listened to the actual NASA people, and when they're talking about getting us to Mars, and how they're saying our biggest obstacle is space radiation, the radiation in space, right? And putting the shielding in the ships to keep us from dying of radiation poisoning on our way,
or even on Mars,
or even just in space.
Well, yeah.
in like the space station and stuff. A lot of the studies are how much radiation can the human body take, right? And I'm like going, that's just freaked me out. I'm all, well, I ain't going to space.
Well, you go Mars. The trip to Mars is one way anyway, right? Supposedly.
Well, currently.
Yeah, that's how.
Because by the time you get back, you'll be.
I don't know how long it takes to get to Mars.
I don't know.
A few years, right? 2 or 3 years.
I don't know.
At our current technological level, unless we discover some.
You have to figure out, because you got to have the fuel to come back, right?
That's why it's a one-way trip.
So,
another thing is that with space combat, you always have, no matter what RPG you're playing, it has to do with the tech level. That's very interesting part of playing in a space RPG, in a RPG that
has space combat.
What would you call it? Science fiction?
Space opera. That's what I would call it.
Space opera, or a science fiction space game, right?
Yeah.
So I was looking at the rules, right, of how different games that are science fiction games deal with space combat, and I took out a few of them that I have. So I took out.
Got a big old pile on the floor.
So like Rogue Trader, I looked at
Starfinder,
and I looked at a bunch of them. Like I even have Star Trek Adventures, and for the most part, most of the time, the way they deal with space combat is ship is like a character.
Yeah.
Right. And depending on the system, like the older games, like Rogue Trader and Traveler and stuff like that, the ship has hit points, it has armor, it has shielding depending on the tech level and all that stuff. And basically, it's a character, and it's doing range combat with another character,
right,
which is another ship. The amount of role playing is probably very minimal because it basically becomes a combat session. And I always, okay, before I go off on some tangent, so it's very, like you said, there's not a lot of leeway for role playing. There's decisions to be made, but they're almost like automatic decisions, right? I'm going to shoot because I'm going to shoot. I'm going to try to fix the ship because I don't want my ship to explode, and I don't want this.
And if I have shields, I'm putting them up now.
Yeah, and I got to repair the shields or whatever. So it does seem a little clunky, and it seems to put you out of that
role-playing environment.
But most combat does anyway, more or less. Like in most games.
Unless it's like feng shui, right? Where you're
right,
where
combat is part of the action, is part of the
because you're telling them how you're gonna shoot your guns as you run, right?
And that's the whole point, is you're being very descriptive. But in most games, combat, it becomes, a lot of people don't like combat because it kind of pops them out of this world that they're in, but then becomes this tactical game. And a lot of games now have kind of made combat into like the back burner, right? If they're trying to stay in a RPG mode, there's all kinds of games that do it different ways. Basically, they eliminate combat, or they make combat so deadly that nobody wants to fight, right? Or it's more like a one shot and you're so damaged that you're not going to keep fighting. Or it's limited to like hand-to-hand combat where you punch somebody and ouch, that hurts. And the English way of fisticuffs, right? Like in the, what was that movie?
The Kingsman, is that the one you're talking about?
No, the one, where, what is it? My God, I can't believe it. The one about the woman who...
Bridget Jones?
Yes, you remember the Englishmen were fighting? Like they were throwing these wild swings at each other and missing, and they actually connected to go, oh, that hurts, right? It was pretty funny.
Are you talking about...
Yes. The Mr. Not
Mr. Darcy?
Mr. Darcy and Hugh Grant.
Yeah.
Yes. So combat is usually takes you out of the whole role-playing experience anyway. The problem is when certain systems, it really takes you out, right? Like that whole grid thing. Anytime you put a grid down, it becomes a different game. Yeah. It becomes a miniature game. Basically, is what it is. And Starfinder and Space Opera, it handled it the exact same way.
Yeah.
You put a big piece of grid of line paper or graph paper, and you're charting which way your ship is turning. And depending on the size of your ship, you can only turn so many degrees. And that's exactly like Space Opera.
The only difference, like when you're saying that right now, I'm thinking about when we play D&D with the boys, or Pathfinder with the boys, and you have out the mat, the battle mat, and you have your figurines out.
Right.
And as soon as you say, oh, you all need to roll initiative, everybody gets excited because in the combat in D&D, each person gets to, it's a turn thing, right?
Right.
But you get to tell what you're going to do.
Right.
Which the difference between that and space combat, they're both simulationists, right? But with space combat, half of the people or more than half of the people are just along for the ride.
Right, exactly.
Which makes it less exciting, where I can the boys' faces light up when you say roll initiative, right?
I think that's the big difference.
That's the big difference.
Unless like Star Trek, like said, everybody has a role.
Right.
And they have a decision of what to do, where, like the pilot, where to fire. In this sense, the captain is the person just giving the order,
right?
But it's up to the individual whether to follow those orders or not.
Yeah.
So which just kind of makes it interesting. So so much simulation do you want to be? Like, I always thought when we were playing Star Wars, any Star Wars game, but mainly, well, the only Star Wars game I've ever played in has been the Fantasy Flight games, like Edge of the Empire, I always thought the idea, well, they have a Star Wars miniature game. So you could always do that, bust out that for the...
Bust out the little ships.
For the role-playing game, play a miniature game. But those miniature games take 2-3 hours to play. And unless everybody has their own ship, it's kind of a boring game.
Right.
Because basically it's a 2-player game, I believe. So that wasn't a good idea, and I never tried that. But I thought I always toyed with that idea.
You could have just used the miniatures.
Right, come up with my own rules. Yeah, that's true. Those rules are pretty good, supposedly. I've never played the miniature game. I know a lot of friends of mine have, and they really enjoy it. And I know a lot of people like collect those things, and it could be costly, and they have huge amount of ships that you could put.
But that's a different game. That's not role playing. That's actually miniature.
That's
game.
A miniature.
Yeah.
Well, that's not a miniature.
Not
game,
a miniature
but,
game, but it's a
plastic model.
Yeah.
Miniature light game. There's that type of simulationist type game, and then there's a more free-form game where you're just like, you try not to get into combat very much. Like you're like that Reddit person said, you make it super deadly. The first shot always blows through your freaking hole, always causes a lot of
the
damage.
Engines are knocked out.
Yeah, so,
it has to do something to make it more exciting for the people, because then you're off of combat and onto what are we going to do so we don't all die.
Right. So where are we going to go?
Yeah.
And what are we going to fix? Because hopefully, not hopefully, but it does more damage than just one thing, right? You know, it blows through a hole through your ship.
It takes out the weapons and part of the engine or something.
And then it injures people.
Yeah.
And then what is engineering going to do?
Then everybody has something to do.
Everybody has something to do. Save somebody, fix something, patch a hole. Because the engineer can't do it all, right?
No.
Right. And I think that's the ultimate idea or the ultimate problem for any role-playing game that's science fiction and deals in space in any way is how much simulation do you want in that game when it comes to space combat.
Unless it's alien and there's no space combat unless you're fighting aliens in your ship.
Right. And you're right. And sometimes they do away with this kind of stuff because the game is so deadly, right? Not the game, but they say space is so deadly, almost nobody's going to go into combat. Because, like, let's say they're space pirates. Well, if they blow up a ship, they might blow up what they're trying to get.
I think Firefly might... Is there space combat in Firefly?
I don't know. Not really.
I'm just thinking of that in Firefly, people did shoot at them every once in a while.
Right.
But their ship was like literally... I don't know.
It was like a big semi-truck.
Yeah.
Right. So the thing is, like, yeah, in Firefly, they're not allowed to have guns, right? Because they're a civilian vehicle.
Yeah.
So they never had guns. So their idea was to always scoot and what do you call it? Get out of there. Scoot out of there is what I'm trying to say.
They didn't have any guns?
No, not ship guns.
Oh.
And in Traveler, like when you first buy your ship, because usually what happens in Traveler, you have to have a ship.
Yes, you do.
Right? You have to have a ship. So a lot of people complain about Traveler, and Space Opera was the same way because you had to have a ship.
And your ship always sucks unless you're working for somebody, right?
Well, that's the problem, right?
Because you got to smuggle stuff so you can get a better ship, so you can fix your ship and all kinds of stuff.
Well, the thing is, ships cost a ton of money, right? Millions of credits. And you're talking about people who
just got out of the military and probably have like 3,000 credits among them.
The only thing is you could get discounts if you're military. That's like minus 10%. But still, you're talking about millions of credits. Right? So what happens is usually people pull their money together, their meager earnings, and they can put a down payment on this thing, but then they're making payments on this fish. It's like a car you really can't afford.
Yeah.
Right? Or in this case, a big truck, like a semi-truck.
Yeah.
And all of you are all in on this business endeavor. And to pay for the truck, you have to make money, which is going from planet to planet, buying and selling stuff and making money off of that. That was Firefly, not The Expanse because it's a military game. But usually you're an independent merchant ship.
Basically, yeah. Basically, that's what you are.
You're a trucker.
You're a trucker in space.
And because you're a civilian trucker, you're not allowed to have guns on it, right? There's no idea.
You're not supposed to have guns. You're not supposed to have contraband.
Well, there's that.
And you're not supposed to, you're going from one place to another. You got to get legitimate jobs so you can get paid, right?
Legitimate cargo is what you're saying.
And every Traveler game I've been in, it's always questionable if any of that cargo is legitimate. There might be some. But I think the last game we played in with Philip as the GM, we got a job to take cargo, but they didn't want us to look in it, which just told you, okay.
Well, I don't know how, what is it? Not real, but how realistic that is. Because I don't know, an independent trucker, does he really know what's in the back of his truck? No, it's all palletized. It's all created. There's a manifest, but how do you know what is really in that stuff? And they're not, no truck, well,
Okay.
no legitimate truck, what? No honest trucker is going to bust open seals and look into the crates and see what's in it to really see.
But they also know where they pick it up, and they're assuming that it's not.
Right, but I mean, let's say you, a truly independent trucker might haul different things from different businesses.
As long as you're not going in and out of different countries, you're probably okay.
Yeah, that's true too. So anyway, but in this case you are, because you're going from planet to planet.
Exactly.
So I think what a lot of complaints about Traveler and even Space Opera, because Space Opera came out in 1980, 81, and Traveler came out in 1977, and they have the whole chart, right? They have every planet is a rich planet, iron planet, agricultural planet, and so they have different stuffs that they can sell.
Yeah,
and they have different things they need.
That was the most boring part of the game to me, while these guys discussed which planet they wanted to go to
and what
they wanted to carry. I was like going, okay, what did I get myself into?
Yeah, because a game of accounting, right?
Yeah,
because
and I'm like going,
a stocks and bonds kind of. Because you're like, oh, if I buy this stuff here that costs me 100 credits per ton, and I go to this other planet, I could sell it for plus or minus 100 or 200.
And I was thinking, if I wanted to do math, I could be at work.
If you want to do accounting, you can be at work. So that was always a problem. But a lot of people enjoy that, trying to make money and make a profit and all that stuff.
That was just the boring part for me, just right then.
On top,
but the exciting part was
the mischief.
Everything, yeah, everything else was good about Traveler. It was that, and then Philip broke out the grid with which planet do you want to go to, and as they're discussing what they're going to haul and what planet we're going to, Jolene's eyes are going, okay, I'll let you guys figure that out. I'm up for whatever.
Well, it was a very open-ended game, right? That's what he was trying to do. He's just like, do whatever you want. I'm like, well, we don't where's the adventure? And I don't
wherever you find it.
And I wasn't sure if there was an adventure until we ended up on a planet that had like a secret base and crazy aliens on it or something. Oh, ultimately, when you look at space combat in a game, it depends on how realistic they're trying to be.
Well, there was no space combat in Traveler when we played it.
Right.
All the combat was on a planet in a secret base, right?
But there is space combat in Traveler.
Yeah.
It's very old school, like you're gonna but there's no grid. It's all based on theoretical distances and stuff. And
I'm sure there's a chart.
You could map it out. I'm sure there's a chart. Yeah, you and your chart, the phobia. But I think what you're looking for when you buy a space game RPG, and you think that space combat is going to be a big part, a lot of it depends on your decision on how realistic you want that space combat to be. For me, I try to totally ignore space combat because, like I said, it's even in Star Trek Adventures, which is probably one of the best systems I've seen, in making sure that everybody's doing something. It can be a little bit mechanical. The only decisions you make is maybe of the 3 things that are broken, which one are you going to fix first, or what are you going to do as a science officer, depending on what weaknesses you want in the ship, and all this other stuff on the enemy ship to shoot at. A medical person, you're saving life, I guess. And the navigator's trying to figure out if he's going to evade, if he's going to try to stay still to give the person shooting a better shot, whatever, things like that happen. To me, I don't really want something super realistic like space opera where you bust out this large sheet of graph paper and here you are and you got to map out when you're going to shoot, kind of like Starfinder.
Yeah. Well, I would suggest, and after reading a lot on this and having experienced space combat myself in Starfinder, I would suggest that you make it as short as possible, as deadly as possible, so you can move on, so everybody can do whatever, unless that's part of the game, like somebody's following you.
I mean, unless you have a group that really likes this detailed space combat game, because I think that's what it is. You're playing a role playing game, And in some games like Starfinder and Space Opera and a few others, when combat starts, it becomes a different game. It becomes a tactical miniature-like game. And if your group enjoys that, then have fun. But if some people in your group are like, they check out like Jolene did, okay, it's time for me to go to bed. Tell me how it ends. I'll see you tomorrow. I'll see you in the next session because this is going to be 2 or 3 hours of boredom. You probably don't want to get into that kind of situation or buy a game that half the people are going to check out when the combat starts. And if you have a lot of space combat between ships, that is. So for me, like I said, I once I tried space combat a few times in Space Opera, I really didn't have space. There wasn't an opportunity. A lot of it was threatening, like we're going to shoot you if you don't do this. And it was all like deception or manipulation or whatever. And I think that's how I usually deal with combat anyway, even in Star Trek Adventures, which, like I said, is probably one of the best role-playing-esque way of handling combat. There's no grid.
Well, also you're in Star Trek, so you want to. The bad guys are bad, right? And you're trying not to get into combat,
right? You usually play the Federation. What about Klingons? I wonder about that.
Oh, Klingons are Klingons. You got to learn how to deal with them, and you don't want to fight them because they're bigger than you, and probably. Right.
So of all the games I own, like I have Ashen Stars, I have Rogue Trader, I have Starfinder.
You have Space Opera and Traveler.
Space Opera, Traveler, Star Wars, and a couple other space games. Like I said, no matter how well they deal with the space combat, I usually try to avoid it because, like I said, it breaks down to a different kind of game, and people who like role playing will probably not enjoy that part of the aspect of the game.
So if you're going to have space combat, you might want to put it in your session 0 and say, when we get to space combat, how do you guys want to handle it?
Right.
Versus just bringing out a piece of grid paper and have part of your party going, okay, I'm going to go get pizza. I'll be back.
Yeah, I'll be back next session because it'll take a session.
This is going to take all day.
Unless, like Jolene says, you make it deadly. You make it the first hit pretty much ends the game or ends the combat. And a lot of that depends on the game level that you're talking about. Traveler, The Expanse, those type of games. One hit, basically, it's the first one to hit that determines the winner. Other higher level or more technological advances like Star Trek, Star Wars, they deal with combat, which you can take punches and keep damage and stuff. There's the idea that a ship is a character that pervades a lot of games, even games I don't own, like Stars Without Number. A lot of OSR games that are space games, they make the spacecraft
make sure the ship has its own.
And like you said, it has hit points, it has armor, and so you're just doing this slugfest out there. Hopefully you do more damage to them than they do to you, and then you're determined the winner.
Because whenever their ship is gonna go boom, that's when you're gonna get out of there, right?
Hopefully they don't let it get that far, but yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So those are some ideas on space combat. Go have fun. This is Gaming Perspectives with
Saul
and Jolene.
And you have a good day.